He carried her in his arms through the dark, a stranger, bleeding unconscious, and he didn't stop to ask who she was or what it would cost him. He just ran. That night, Caleb Mercer made a decision that every sensible man in Barrow Creek would have called foolish. He gave a dying woman his last blanket, his last fire, and his last piece of bread. He had nothing left to give. And somehow, that was exactly enough to change both of their lives forever. If this story moves you, subscribe to this channel, follow along until the very end, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see just how far this story travels. The night Caleb Mercer found her, he almost didn't stop. He almost kept walking. He had been out since before sunrise, 12 hours of pulling wire, mending fence posts, dragging his body across frozen ground that didn't care whether he lived or died. His hands were bleeding at the knuckles. His boots had a crack in the left sole that let in mud every third step. He had eaten half a biscuit at noon and nothing since. His stomach had given up reminding him about it around sundown. 5 years old, and some days Barrow Creek felt like it was slowly swallowing him whole. Territory of Montana in the spring of 1887 was not a gentle place. The winters came in like a hammer and left like a slow poison even after the snow melted. The cold stayed in the ground, in the timber, in the bones of men who had been out in it too long. Cattle prices were down. The big ranch owners, men like Gerald Prentice and the Aldrich brothers, were buying up every parcel of land they could find, squeezing out the small operators one bad season at a time. Caleb had survived 3 bad seasons in a row. His cattle herd was down to 14 head. He had started the decade with 32. The broken wagon in his yard had been broken since October and would stay until he could afford 2 new axle bolts he had been budgeting for since February. The cabin had a gap in the north wall where the wind came through at night and rattled the tin cup on his table like a nervous hand. He was walking home in the dark, thinking about those axle bolts when he heard it. A sound, low, not an animal sound, something else. He stopped walking, curved around a stand of cottonwood trees near the property gate. There was thick no moon, no lantern, just the wind and the sound of something alive and hurting underneath it. Caleb stood still for a moment. His hand moved to the rifle on his shoulder. Out of Montana, sound in the dark could mean a lot of things, and most of them were bad. But then he heard it again. It was a breath, wet and shallow, and a breath a person makes when breathing has become work. He moved toward it without thinking. She was on the ground beside a wrecked carriage. The carriage had gone off the road and into a drainage ditch, one wheel shattered clean off the axle. The whole thing tilted sideways at an ugly angle. The horse was gone. Run off or dead, he couldn't tell in the dark. The woman was on her side, in the mud beside the carriage door, one arm stretched out like she had tried to crawl somewhere and didn't make it. Caleb crouched down beside her. Her clothing was expensive. He could tell that even in the near dark, even caked with mud and torn at the shoulder. The kind of clothing that women in Barrow Creek didn't wear. The kind that came from somewhere east, from a world where people wore clothes that were built for looking at, not for living in. Was pale. There was blood at her temple, dried now, where her head had struck something during the crash. Her lips were dry and cracked. She was breathing, but it was that thin, struggling breath that made him move faster than he had moved all day. He pressed 2 fingers to the side of her neck. Her pulse was there. "Hey," he said. Not loud, just enough. "Hey, can you hear me?" Nothing. He looked up and down the road. Empty in both directions. No sign of anyone, no riders, no wagon, no lamplight in the distance. She had been traveling with, if anyone, was gone. He looked back at her. He was exhausted. He had nothing at his cabin, no medicine to speak of, barely enough food to get himself through the week, a fire that would need rebuilding from near nothing. Bringing her back would cost him sleep, wood, food. It would cost him the half day he had planned to spend tomorrow on the north fence before the next rain came in. He knew all of that. He picked her up anyway. She weighed less than he expected, and that scared him more than her stillness did. He adjusted her in his arms, her head against his shoulder, her feet hanging down, and he walked back toward the cabin. 12 hours of labor already in his legs, and now this. His back tightened at the third step and didn't loosen after that. He didn't stop. The cabin was cold when he got back. Caleb laid her on the single cot that served as his bed and got the fire going first. No good doing anything else with freezing hands and no light. He worked fast. The kindling caught. The larger pieces caught after that. And by the time the fire was breathing on its own, he was back at the cot looking at her in the firelight for the first time. She was young, 26, maybe 28. Dark hair, now loose and tangled from the mud. A cut at her right temple, not deep enough to be dangerous, but bad enough to have bled freely before it dried, forming along her left cheekbone that would be spectacular by morning. Both hands scraped raw at the palms. She had tried to catch herself when she fell. He brought water. He cleaned the cut her temples slowly, carefully, the way his mother had taught him to clean wounds, no scrubbing, just pressure and patience. He found the one clean cloth he owned and tore it in half. Tied one piece around her head, not tight, just enough to cover the cut. Left the other piece damp on her forehead. He found his one extra blanket, the heavy one, the wool one, that had gotten him through 2 January nights when the temperature dropped below anything reasonable, and he put it over her. Then he sat in the chair beside the fire and watched her breathe. He did not sleep. He sat there in the dark and the firelight, listening to her breathe get a little stronger over the next 2 hours, and he felt something loosen in his chest when it did. He didn't have a name for what that feeling was. He was not a man who spent a lot of time naming his feelings. He just sat with it. Around 2 in the morning, she moved. Her fingers at first, a curl and release, like someone reaching for something in a dream and letting go. Then her head turned slightly. Then she made a sound that was not quite a word and not quite a cry, but somewhere in between. The sound of someone swimming up from somewhere very deep and not being sure what they'd find when they reached the surface. Caleb leaned forward in his chair. Easy, he said. All right, you're inside, you're warm. Her eyes opened. They were dark eyes, and they moved fast, ceiling, fire, walls, him taking in everything at once, with a sharpness that surprised him. She was not confused the way people usually were when they first woke from something bad. She was afraid. She started to sit up. Oh, he put a hand out, not touching her, just a gesture. You've got a head wound, don't come up fast. She stopped, her eyes locked on his hand, then on his face. Who are you? Her voice was hoarse, stripped down to almost nothing, but the words were clear and deliberate. Sir, this is my land, my cabin. He kept his voice flat, unthreatening, the way you spoke to a spooked horse. I found you beside the road by the property gate. Carriage went in the ditch. She was quiet for a moment. Eyes moved around the cabin, again slower this time, reading it. This is gone, he added. I don't know if it ran off or if someone... He stopped. I didn't see any sign of anyone else on the road. Something moved across her face at that. A shadow. And gone. How long have I been here? She asked. 8 hours. Maybe a little more. She closed her eyes. A moment she just breathed deliberately, like someone deciding something. Then she asked, did you see anyone on the road? Before you found me. The question was careful. Too careful for someone who had just regained consciousness. No, he said. Nobody. She nodded once slowly. What's your name? He asked. A pause. Not the pause of someone trying to remember. Of someone deciding how much to say. Evelyn, she said. Evelyn Whitmore. She slept again before sunrise. Real sleep this time, not the unconsciousness of injury, but something that looked like exhaustion given permission. Caleb finally let himself sleep too, upright in the chair for about 3 hours. He woke. The fire was down to coals, and she was sitting up on the cot, watching him. He startled. Couldn't help it. Sorry, she said, and she almost looked like she meant it. He rubbed his face. How's your head? Hurts. That'll last a few days. She was still wearing the ruined dress. There was nothing else to offer her, and she hadn't asked, but she had folded the blanket neatly and set it at the end of the cot, which struck him as a strange thing for a person in her situation to do. He almost said something about it and didn't. You don't have much, she said. It wasn't an insult. She was simply stating what she saw. Oh, he agreed. And you brought me here anyway. You were bleeding in a ditch. She looked at him steadily. Most men in this territory would have kept walking. Caleb stood up and moved toward the fire to get the coals going again. Most men in this territory keep to themselves about what they do and don't do. She was quiet for a moment. Then quietly, thank you, Mr. Sir. He didn't say you're welcome. He just started making coffee with the last of what he had. She didn't explain herself. Not that first morning. He didn't ask. That was perhaps the first thing that surprised her about him, not the kindness, because she had encountered kindness before, often with something attached to it. Surprised her was the absence of demand. He fed her. He left her alone. When he went out to do the morning chores, he didn't ask her to explain herself first or tell her when she'd have to leave. He just went out and did the work, sat in the cabin and listened to him work and tried to understand what kind of man she had landed with. She had been on the road for 2 days when the carriage went into the ditch. She had not been traveling alone. She had hired a driver in Billings, a man named Chester, who had taken the advance payment she offered and driven her south and west into the valley. The axle cracked on a hidden rut in the road after dark. Chester had climbed down, looked at the damage, said something she couldn't remember now, and walked away into the dark. He had walked away, left her there. She had tried to follow him. That's when she'd fallen. After that, she didn't remember much until the firelight and the voice saying, "Easy, easy. You're inside. You're warm." She looked around the cabin in the gray morning light while the sound of Caleb's work came through the walls. She read the room the way she had been taught. To read rooms, everything a space contains tells you about the person who lives in it. What she read here was not poverty, not exactly. Poverty had a particular quality of surrender to it. What she read here was a man who had very little and was fighting for every inch of it. The axle bolts. She almost smiled at the 2 rusted axle bolts sitting on the windowsill like a savings account. A man who kept the thing he was saving for right where he could see it. She had known men with $100,000 who couldn't have told you what they were saving for. When Caleb came back inside, he found her standing at the window, looking at the bolts. He stopped just inside the door. 2 bolts, she said, without turning around. Wagon repair. Yes. How long have you been saving for it? For a moment. Since February. She turned from the window. It was 4 months ago, Mr. Mercer. I know what month it is, he said, but without heat. He moved to hang his coat on the hook by the door. Those bolts cost what? $2 at the hardware in town? $1.50. She looked at him. A man who works this hard should be able to afford $1.50 by April. A man who works this hard in this valley, with 14 head of cattle and contracts he signed before he understood what he was signing. He stopped. He didn't finish it, but she had heard it, every word of it. She stayed. Not permanently and not without question, she stayed the way. Water stays in a leaking vessel, always at the edge of gone. But the days passed and she was still there. And after the first 3 days, some unspoken negotiations seemed to occur between them. She was not helpless. That became clear fast. On the 3rd morning, Caleb came in from the cattle and found her at the small table with his ledger book, the one he kept his numbers in, careful cramped calculations of a man, trying to make not enough stretch into barely enough spread open in front of her. He stopped in the doorway. That's private, he said. I know. She didn't look up. But I think you should look at this line here. Against his better judgment, he came inside and looked into an entry from 2 years ago, a contract payment to the Aldrich Grazing Association, a recurring fee paid quarterly. You're paying a grazing fee to Aldrich? She asked. For the eastern pasture. My deed includes it, but there's an access road that crosses Aldrich land, so your deed includes it, she repeated. She looked up at him now. Eyes were sharp and focused, and not at all the eyes of a woman in recovery. Pull your deed. He pulled the deed. She read it in silence for 4 minutes he counted, because he didn't know what else to do with himself, and then she set it on the table and tapped it with one finger. This access road, she said. It's a county recorded road, established 1879. It's not Aldrich land. It's a public thoroughfare. Caleb stared at her. Aldrich told me. Aldrich told you what was convenient for Aldrich. She said it without drama. It's just fact. You have been paying a fee on a road you have every right to use without paying. How long? He sat down in the chair because his legs made that decision before his brain did. 4 years, he said. She did the math in her head. He could see her doing it. You've paid Aldrich approximately $240 for a road he had no legal claim to charge you for. She paused. That's a great number of axle bolts, Mr. Mercer. Silence in the cabin after she said that was the loudest silence Caleb had heard in years. He put his hands on the table. He looked at them for a moment, the scraped knuckles, the broken thumbnail that had been split for 3 weeks, the calluses that had built themselves into a second skin over 20 years of this kind of work. How do you know that? He finally said. She was quiet for a moment. Then I know land law. I know how deeds work. I know how men like Aldrich use confusion and paperwork and other people's trust against them. She picked up the deed and set it in front of him. I've seen it done before. To who? The shadow crossed her face again. The same one from the first night. To me, she said. He didn't push her on it. That was the second thing that surprised her. He sat with what she had told him, quietly. The way a man sits with something heavy that he knows he'll have to carry for a while before he can set it down. That evening, he came inside from the second round of chores and said, I'd like you to look at the other contracts, if you're willing. She looked at him across the table. Yes, she said. I'm willing. They sat together at the table until past midnight, going through every piece of paper he owned. He was. Evelyn read while Caleb made notes. She explained as she went, not talking down to him, not performing expertise, just talking the way a person talks when they know something useful and they've found someone who deserves to hear it. He listened the way people listen when something they've been trying to understand for years is finally being explained in words they can understand. The candle burned down. She had found 3 separate agreements where Caleb was paying more than he owed, and one contract, the most important one, where he had unknowingly signed away first purchase rights on his own cattle to a broker in Billings who had never set foot on the ranch. Caleb sat back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a long time. I signed that, he said. I signed it myself.
Yes.
But you didn't understand what you were signing. I should have. A rancher, Mr. Mercer, not a lawyer. She kept her voice steady. This is what men like that broker count on. That you are working too hard to read the fine print, that you trust a handshake and a good word. She paused. It is not a character flaw to trust people. It is a character flaw in them to exploit it. Caleb was quiet for a long time after that. Finally, he said, can those contracts be challenged? She met his eyes, some of them. And the Aldrich fee? One, she said, I can almost guarantee. He nodded slowly. Then, for a woman who won't tell me why she was alone on a county road at night with a hired driver who ran off and left her, a remarkable amount about territorial land law. Evelyn held his gaze. Yes, she said quietly. I suppose I do. She helped him the next day. And the day after that, it started with the contracts and the paperwork. Then she asked about his cattle operation, the feeding schedule, the water access, grazing rotation, and he told her, and she asked questions that nobody had ever asked him before. Good questions. Questions that made him think about things he had been doing by habit for so long that he had forgotten to wonder whether there was a better way. She had never worked a ranch in her life. She was honest about that. She had a mind that moved fast and clear through problems, and she was not afraid to say I don't know, and not afraid to say I think I do know either. He taught her things. He showed her how to read weather by the shape of clouds and the behavior of the cattle. He showed her how the fence posts needed to be set deep enough that the frost couldn't push them loose. He showed her the right way to lift a bale so your lower back didn't pay for it. 3 days later, a lesson she took seriously after ignoring it the first time and paying for it exactly as he had warned. You were right. She said that evening, rubbing her back, trying not to show it. I know, he said, without looking up from his food. That's an irritating quality in a person. So I've been told. She almost smiled. He almost saw it. They were 1 week in when the first rider came. Caleb was at the water trough when he heard the horse on the road, and he straightened up and watched. A single rider, coming from the north from the direction of town, moving at a pace that said purposeful, not casual. Rider was a man named Holt, one of the Aldrich hands, a big red-faced man who Caleb had dealt with before. Holt pulled his horse up at the gate and leaned on the saddle horn and looked at Caleb with an expression that was trying to be friendly and not quite getting there. You took in a traveler. Heard wrong, Caleb said. Holt looked at the cabin. Mrs. Aldrich was concerned. Told me to come check if everyone was all right over here. Everything's fine. Word in town is it's a woman, young woman, fancy clothes. He paused, the friendly expression tilting towards something else. The kind of woman who might be in some trouble. Caleb looked at him without expression. I got cattle to water, Holt. You tell Mrs. Aldrich I appreciate her concern. A beat. Holt's eyes stayed on the cabin a moment longer than they needed to. Then he turned his horse and rode back the way he came. Caleb watched him all the way to the road. Then he walked to the cabin. Evelyn was standing inside, just away from the window. She had heard it. Their eyes met. How long do you think we have? He asked. She didn't pretend she didn't know what he was asking. Long, she said. A few days, maybe less. He nodded. Evelyn, he said. He almost never used her name. She noticed. I'm not going to ask you to leave, but if there's something you need to tell me before whoever's coming gets here, I'd rather hear it from you. She looked at him for a long moment. I know, she said. She didn't say more. Not yet, and he let that be enough. Now, outside, the sound of Holt's horse faded down the road toward town, and somewhere to the north, in the direction of Billings, a man named Richard Blackwell was already reading a telegram, already pulling on his coat, already giving orders to his men about what to do when they found her. The morning after Holt rode away, Caleb found Evelyn already awake before him. That was not unusual anymore. In the 8 days she had been at the ranch, she had developed a habit of rising before the light changed, not to work, not yet, to sit at the table with whatever was left of the previous night's coffee and think. He had learned not to disturb her during those early minutes, because whatever she was working through in the silence before dawn, she needed to work through it without company. But this morning was different. She was not sitting still. She was standing at the table, and she had pulled out his ledger again, not to read it. He realized to write in it. She was writing on a blank page in the back, her handwriting small and precise, filling lines faster than he had ever seen anyone write by hand. He stood in the doorway for a moment without speaking. She said, without looking up, I know you're there. Isn't hiding, he said, and came inside. He moved to the fire, got the coffee going, and sat in his chair. He watched her write for another few minutes. She filled one page, turned it, started another. Finally, she set the pencil down and turned to face him. Susan, I've been going through the numbers in my head all night, she said. Aldrich fee, the broker contract in Billings, the third agreement with the feed supplier, the one where the price per unit escalates automatically after year 2 with no cap. You've been overpaying on that one for 14 months. Caleb wrapped both hands around his coffee tin. How much? Roughly $60. He said nothing. $60 was 3 months of groceries. $60 was the wagon fixed and running again. $60 was a small herd of sheep that could have given him wool to sell. There's more, she said. Of course there is. She sat down across from him. Caleb. She almost never used his first name either. He noticed it the same way he had noticed when she noticed it about him. Not a poor manager. You are not bad at this. You have been systematically picked apart by men who knew exactly which words to use and exactly how to use them on a man who was too busy working to read what he was signing. It sounds like an excuse. It isn't, it's a diagnosis. She kept her eyes on him. An excuse is something you hide behind. A diagnosis is something you work from. He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, you sound like someone who's needed to tell herself that. Aren't, but real. Yes, she said quietly. I have. He didn't push it. He drank his coffee. She sat with him in the quiet for a moment. And then she pulled the ledger back toward her and said, Here's what I think you should do. And they were back to work before the sun had fully cleared the ridge. That was the rhythm they had found. Not planned, not discussed, just arrived at, the way most true things arrive. She thought in structure and strategy, in numbers and legal language, and the architecture of agreements. He thought in weather and soil, the behavior of cattle, and the 1,200 small decisions a day that kept a working ranch breathing. Between the two of them, they covered ground that neither one could have covered alone. He knew she was aware of that. He could see it in the way she watched him work, not with admiration exactly, but with a kind of recalibration, like someone adjusting an estimate they had made too quickly. What he didn't know yet was how much she was still hiding. And he was about to find out that he had been vastly underestimating what was coming. 3 days after Holt's visit, a second rider came. This one was different. This one came at midday and didn't slow down at the gate. He rode straight up to the cabin yard and stopped his horse without being invited in. Was a particular kind of rudeness in cattle country that said everything about how the man measured other people. He was well dressed. Not ranch dressed, he wore the clothes of a man who did his work in offices and meeting rooms, in the kind of spaces where the floor didn't have mud on it. It was maybe 45, broad through the shoulders, with a face that was used to getting what it asked for. Caleb was at the side of the cabin when he arrived. He straightened up and walked around to the front without hurrying. "Help you," he said. The man looked at him the way men like that always looked at men like Caleb, a quick inventory, a quiet filing of information. Not hostile exactly, just assessing. "My name is Garrett Cole," the man said. "I represent certain business interests in the Billings territory. I'm looking for a woman, a Miss Evelyn Whitmore. We have reason to believe she passed through this area some days ago." Kept his face neutral. Lots of people pass through. This one wouldn't have passed through quietly. Cole's eyes moved to the cabin door. She would have been injured. Carriage accident on the South County Road, approximately 9 days ago. Interest. Cole smiled. It was the kind of smile that had been practiced until it looked like it cost nothing. Her family is concerned for her welfare. Her relatives have been searching for her since the accident. Relatives, Caleb repeated. That's right. Caleb looked at him for a moment. Then he said, "I don't know anyone matching that description. And this is private property. So, if you don't have other business here, I'd appreciate you turning that horse around." Cole didn't move immediately. He looked at the cabin again, the window, the door, the thin line of smoke from the chimney. And then he looked back at Caleb with an expression that had gone from practiced friendliness to something flatter. "Sir, Mr. Mercer, this woman, if she's here, she may not be who she told you she was. She has a history of instability. Her family is worried she may be misrepresenting her situation to people she encounters." Caleb looked at him steadily. "I told you. Don't know her." Another beat. Cole reached into his coat and produced a card, held it out. Caleb took it. "If your memory improves," Cole said, "there's a finder's reward. $50. He turned his horse and rode out the way he came. Caleb stood in the yard until the sound of the horse faded. He looked at the card in his hand-printed, expensive paper, a Billings address, and he walked and set it on the table. Evelyn was standing against the far wall. She had been listening through the window. "Not from my family," she said. Her voice was controlled, but there was something underneath it, not fiercely, something colder than fear. Certainty, the certainty of someone who had been expecting this. His name might be Cole, or it might not. "But he works for Richard Blackwell." Caleb sat down in his chair. "Who is Richard Blackwell?" She sat down across from him. A moment, she was very still, and he could see her making a decision. He could actually see it happening. The calculation behind her eyes, the weighing of something heavy. "Father's brother," she said. "My uncle by marriage. The man who's been managing my father's estate for the past 3 years, since my father became ill." Caleb waited. "My father is Harold Whitmore," she said. He owned approximately 14,000 acres in the Northern Valley. Farmer rights, cattle operations, mineral claims on 2 separate parcels." She paused. "It is one of the 3 or 4 largest private land holdings in the Montana Territory." The cabin was very quiet. Caleb looked at her. At the ruined dress she was still wearing, patched now at the shoulder, with a piece of his old flannel shirt because it was the best they could do. At the woman who had spent the past 8 days learning how to lift bales properly and reading his contracts by candlelight and making coffee before sunrise. 9,000 acres, he said. Yes. And you were on a county road alone at night with a hired driver. Who left me? Because someone paid him to. She said it without flinching. Chester didn't crack that axle on a rut in the road, Caleb. He drove into that drainage ditch deliberately. He took my travel bag, the one with my documents, my letters, my identification papers, and he walked away. She met his eyes. Someone wanted me stranded. Injured, possibly. Helpless, certainly. Gone from any place where I could cause them difficulty. Caleb was quiet for a long moment. What difficulty could you cause them? He asked. My father is dying, she said. He has been dying for 7 months. He goes, the estate passes to his direct heir. She paused. That's me. Not Richard Blackwell. Not the cousins. Was. Not the lawyers Richard has spent 3 years cultivating. Me. And Richard has known that since the day my father's doctor told him what was coming. He's been preparing. For 2 years at minimum. Having money, reclassifying deeds. Having my father sign documents during periods when he wasn't, when his mind wasn't. She stopped. She looked down at the table for a moment. When she looked back up, something in her face had shifted. It was hardened. My father would never have signed those papers if he had understood what he was signing. He is a good man. He was always a good man. The past tense hit the air between them and stayed there. How long? Caleb asked. The doctor said before summer. She straightened her back. This is why the timing matters. That is why Cole is here now. If I'm missing, if I'm legally unavailable, if my whereabouts are unknown, Richard can move to have me declared absent for purposes of the estate. He only needs a judge. He has 3 of them in his pocket already in Billings. He looked at him steadily. If I don't reappear with documentation of who I am and what I'm entitled to, I lose everything my father built. And Richard Blackwell knows that. Caleb absorbed all of it. Then he said, your documents were in the bag Chester took. The letters, the identification. Yes. He leaned forward. What do you have left? What can you prove? She reached into the front of the dress, into a pocket sewn into the lining, one he hadn't known was there, and she produced a single folded paper. She set it on the table between them. He looked at it without touching it. Is that? My father's original deed of estate. Handwritten, dated 1871, with his signature and the signature of the territorial land registrar. She held his eyes. I never put it in the bag. I kept it on my person because she paused. Because I was not entirely sure I could trust Chester. I had my suspicions, but not enough to not get in the carriage. I needed to get here. I needed to get to the county land office before Richard could file a new set of transfer documents. She gestured at the road outside. I didn't make it in time. Caleb sat back. He looked at the ceiling. He thought about the card on his table, 50 Billings address, a man named Cole who smiled like it cost nothing. He thought about Holt showing up 3 days ago on behalf of the Aldrich, asking about a young woman in fancy clothes. He thought about 14,000 acres. He thought about 4 years of paying a grazing fee on a road he had every right to use for free. He looked back at her. How far is the county land office from here? 12 miles north. Hawthorne. And if you walk in there with that deed and your name and your face, is that enough? She considered it. It's enough to establish a claim. Prevent Richard from filing an uncontested transfer. She paused. But it won't be easy. He has people everywhere. And if Cole knows I'm in this area. Cole doesn't know anything, Caleb said. I told him I'd never met you. He didn't believe you. Caleb agreed. He didn't. He stood up. I'm going to go move the cattle. While I do that, I need you to write down everything you just told me. Every name, every date, every document Richard has had your father sign. Everything you know. He moved to the door and stopped. She blinked. Can I ride? A horse. Can you do it? I haven't in some years. That's a yes with qualifications. Good enough. He pulled on his coat. 2 horses. The bay is easier. We'll leave before light tomorrow. Stared at him. Caleb, write it down, he said. All of it. He went out before she could say anything else. She sat at the table for a moment with the folded deed in front of her and the pencil in her hand. Then she started writing. She wrote for 4 hours without stopping. He came back in at dusk, and she was still writing. He cooked what there was: beans, cornbread from a flour he was nearly out of, and set a plate next to her without interrupting. She ate without looking up, her left hand holding the food, her right hand still moving the pencil. At some point past 9 o'clock, she set the pencil down and looked at what she had written. 8 pages in the back of his ledger. Names, dates, amounts, locations. It was a map of everything Richard Blackwell had done and was planning to do, laid out in her small, precise handwriting like a blueprint. She looked up. Caleb was asleep in the chair. He looked exhausted in the way that only people who have been exhausted for years look, not just tonight's tired, but the accumulated tired of a man who had been fighting uphill for so long he had forgotten there was a level road. His hands were loose in his lap, the broken thumbnail, the scraped knuckles, the calluses. She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about the $50 Cole had offered. She knew what $50 meant to a man with 2 axle bolts on his windowsill. She thought about what it would mean to him to take that money the wagon fixed. The Aldrich fee challenged with money in his pocket to spend on a lawyer, a real chance at the cattle operation he had been half killing himself to maintain. She thought about the fact that he hadn't even hesitated. It is not something you trade when the price is high enough. He hadn't said those words yet. He would say them later when it mattered most. She saw them already in everything he did, every quiet choice he made without announcement or expectation of recognition. She had grown up in a world where value was always attached to something: a name, a deed, an amount of money, a strategic alliance. She had been valued her entire life for what she was connected to and what she stood to inherit. Even the people who had been kind to her had been kind in a way that was somehow also aware of what she was worth. This man had carried her in from a ditch and given her his blanket, and he hadn't known her name. She folded the pages she had written and put them inside the front cover of the ledger. Then she blew out the candle and let him sleep. She was awake for another 2 hours in the dark, the situation over and over in her mind: the missing documents, the 12 miles to Hawthorne, the timing of Cole's arrival, the window she had before Richard could file, and at the end of 2 hours she had a plan. Not a safe plan, not a certain plan, but a plan that had a real chance if they moved fast and if Caleb was willing to do something that would put him directly in the path of Richard Blackwell's money and influence. She was asking a man with 14 cattle and 2 axle bolts to stand against one of the most powerful land operators in the Montana Territory. She needed to tell him that clearly so he understood what he was agreeing to. In the morning, before the light changed, she closed her eyes and made herself sleep. Outside, the wind had shifted, coming from the north now, cold with it, and something else: the particular stillness of a territory that was holding its breath. She did not know that 12 miles away in Hawthorne, Cole had taken a room at the only hotel, that he had sent a telegram to Billings 3 hours ago, that the telegram had said, in plain commercial language, subject located, seating with containment, require authorization for secondary measures. She did not know that the reply, which arrived in under an hour, said only, do not let her reach the land office. She did not know any of that. But the morning was coming fast, and Richard Blackwell's men rode faster. Caleb woke at 4 in the morning with the particular alertness of a man who had learned to sleep with part of himself still watching. He didn't know what had woken him. He sat in the dark for a moment, listening. Horses. Not one, not two, more than 2. On the county road, moving toward the property, moving faster than a casual rider, faster than a man coming to check on a neighbor, on his feet, before he was fully conscious of deciding to stand, to the window. 3 riders, coming from the north, moving at a pace that said they had a destination, and they knew where it was. Cole had not waited for morning. Caleb turned from the window. Evelyn. He said it at regular volume, no panic in it, because panic was a luxury you couldn't afford when things moved fast. Get up. Right now, she was awake in seconds. He heard her move in the dark. Riders, he said. 3 of them. Road. They're not stopping at the gate. A pause. How long, she asked. 3 minutes. Maybe less. He heard her stand. He heard the rustle of movement. Then her voice, and it was steadier than it had any right to be the deed. I see it. He grabbed it off the table and pressed it into her hand. The ledger pages, got them. He shoved them into his coat. Can you ride right now? Yes. Good, back door. Saddle the bay. Don't light a lantern. Can you do that in the dark? Yes. Go, she went. Caleb turned back to the window. The riders were inside the property now, past the gate, crossing the dark yard. He could hear them clearly. He picked up his rifle from beside the door. He did not go out shooting. That was not who he, and it was not what this situation called for. It called for was about 90 seconds of conversation while Evelyn got the bay saddled and ready. It's 90 seconds of standing in a doorway with a rifle across his chest, which was a language that every man on horseback in the Montana Territory understood perfectly well. He opened the door and stepped out. The 3 riders pulled up. The one in front was not Cole. Cole was a businessman, not a rider. This was someone Cole had sent. A big man, younger, wearing a working man's clothes, but carrying himself with the particular ease of someone who was comfortable with the work he had been hired to do. Sure, the man said. That's right. We're looking for a woman. We have reason to believe she's on this property. Caleb held the rifle across his chest, not raised, threatening, just present. I already spoke to your employer this afternoon. I told him what I'm telling you. There's no one here. The big man looked at the cabin behind him. Mind if we take a look? I mind very much, Caleb said. This is private property and it's 4 o'clock in the morning. You've got no badge and no paper and you've got no right to be here. So here's what's going to happen. You're going to turn those horses around and you're going to ride back to Hawthorne and you're going to tell Cole that Caleb Mercer doesn't appreciate night visitors. The big man smiled. Not Cole's practice smile, a simpler one. Sir, he said slowly. You understand who we're working for. I understand who you're working for, Caleb said. That doesn't change the property line. A pause. The 3 men looked at each other. From the back of the cabin, Caleb heard it, the bay moving. Up sound, barely audible, but audible. The big man heard it too. His eyes moved past Caleb toward the barn. And in that second, that single second of the man's attention shifting, Caleb stepped 1 pace to the left, deliberately, moving into the man's sight line, filling it. I'll give you a count of 3, Caleb said. His voice was very quiet. After 3, I stopped being polite. The man looked at him for a long moment, and he looked at the rifle. Then he looked at Caleb's face. Whatever he saw there, it was enough. He pulled his horse around. The other 2 followed. They rode back toward the gate, not fast, not running, because men like that didn't run, but they rode. And he was. Caleb stood in the doorway until they cleared the property. Then he walked to the barn fast. Evelyn had the bay saddled. Hands were sure, her movements quick. She looked up when he came in. She asked. For now. He moved to his own horse. We need to ride before they come back with Cole or with more men. You still willing to do this? She handed him the bay's reins and looked at him. Caleb, she said, I need to tell you something before we ride. He paused, hands on his horse. What Cole told you about me being unstable, about my family being concerned, there's going to be more of that. Richard Blackwell is very good at making people believe a particular story about me. He's been building that story for 2 years. She held his eyes. When we get to Hawthorne, when we get to the land office, people are going to know his version of who I am before they know mine. I need you to know that going in. Caleb looked at her for a moment. Then he said, I know who you are. She opened her mouth and closed it again. I've been watching you work for over a week, he said. I've seen what you are, and what you are is someone who reads a contract in 4 minutes and finds the fraud in it, someone who writes 8 pages of legal documentation by candlelight without stopping, and someone who saddled a horse in the dark without a lantern in under 2 minutes. He pulled himself up onto his horse. Richard Blackwell tells people about you. I know what I've seen. I'll say so to anyone who asks. She stood there for a second longer than she meant to. Then she swung up onto the bay. They rode out of the barn and turned north, into the dark, into the 12 miles between them and the county land office in Hawthorne, riding faster than was safe on a dark road, because safe was no longer the relevant variable. Behind them, the ranch sat empty and quiet. On the windowsill in the cabin, the two axle bolts caught the first gray light of pre-dawn and glinted like small promises. On the county road ahead of them, somewhere in the dark between the ranch and Hawthorne, Cole was already riding, already knowing she was coming, already 2 steps ahead. So he believed. They rode hard for the first 4 miles without speaking. The dark was thick around them, and the road was uneven. Caleb could feel his horse adjusting, finding its footing, and he listened for the bay behind him to make sure Evelyn was keeping pace. She was, whatever she had lost in riding skill over the years, she had recovered fast. He could hear her breathing controlled, deliberate, and the bay's steady rhythm beneath her. At the 4-mile mark, he slowed. She came up alongside him without being asked. "They'll take the main road into Hawthorne," he said, keeping his voice low even though there was no one to hear them. "Habit. Cole doesn't know this valley. He's been here 2 days. He'll go the way he came. And we're not going the main road. No. There's a cattle trail that cuts 2 miles off the north approach. Comes out behind the feed mill, 2 blocks from the land office." He paused. "For going. Then we should move." He looked at her in the dark. She was sitting straight on the bay, her chin level, her hands easy on the reins. Bruise on her cheekbone had faded to a yellow-green. Over the past week, he could just make it out in the pre-dawn gray. "You doing all right?" he asked. "I'll do better when we're there," she said. He turned his horse onto the cattle trail, and she followed without hesitation. They rode the next 8 miles in less than an hour, which was faster than it should have been on a rough track in the dark, and Caleb's horse protested twice, at gullies it didn't see coming. Both times he steadied it and kept moving. He heard the bay stumble once behind him, his whole body tensed, and then heard Evelyn's voice, low and firm, "Easy. I've got you," talking to the horse the way he had showed her, and the bay found its feet again. He didn't say anything about it, but something in his chest loosened a little. They came out behind the feed mill as the sky was turning the first pale gray of actual dawn. Hawthorne was waking up slowly, a few lights in windows, the sound of someone moving in the mill, a dog barking 3 streets over. Caleb pulled his horse up and Evelyn came alongside him. "The land office opens at 8, she said. "We have about an hour." "That's enough time for Cole to figure out we didn't come the main road and start looking." "Yes," he thought for a moment. "Is there anyone in Hawthorne you know? Anyone who'd be on your side?" She was quiet. He could see her thinking through it. "Alderton, he knew my father. He officiated at my parents' wedding 30 years ago." She paused. "Richard has been working on the judiciary for 2 years. I don't know where Alderton stands now." "What about the land office clerk?" "I've never met him. I believe his name is Warren. Daniel Warren. He's been in that position for 6 years." She looked at Caleb. "He'll know my name. My father's name is on half the land records in this county. That's something, or it's a liability, depending on what Richard has already told him." Caleb swung down from his horse. "Stay here. Keep the horses quiet." She grabbed his arm. "Where are you going?" "To find out what we're walking into before we walk into it." He looked at her hand on his arm, then at her face. She let go. He walked around the side of the feed mill. There was a man loading sacks at the mill's back door, early worker, up before the town. Caleb approached him at an angle that wasn't threatening and said, "Morning. Here regular?" The man looked up. 6 days a week." "You know if a man named Cole came through town yesterday?" "Businessman type. Billings man. Well dressed?" The worker set down his sack. He looked at Caleb with a particular expression of a man being asked something he's been told not to discuss. Might have seen someone like that at the hotel. "He have company?" Few riders, a pause. "Heard he was at the land office yesterday afternoon." It closed. Caleb kept his face still. "Heard what he was doing there?" Kerr picked up his sack again. "Heard he was filing something." "Know what?" He turned back to his work. "That's all I know." The Caleb went back to Evelyn. She saw his face before he said a word. "He filed something," she said. It was not a question. Yesterday afternoon, before close of business, he took hold of his horse's reins. I don't know what. She closed her eyes for exactly 1 second. Then she opened them. Then we need to get to Warren before Cole does this morning. Or Cole can add to whatever he filed yesterday. She slid down from the bay. Can we stable these horses? Somewhere? We can't walk into the land office with 2 horses standing outside. Cole will know we're here, he thought for a moment. Miller's stable is 2 streets over. Miller won't ask questions if I pay him not to. Then let's go. They moved through the back streets of Hawthorne with the horses in hand, keeping off the main road, reaching Miller's stable without incident. Caleb paid the man with the last of what he had in his pocket, $4, and Miller took the horses into the back without a word or a second look. That was the thing about men who had been around long enough. They knew when not to see things. Then they stood on the street outside Miller's stable, and Caleb looked at Evelyn and said, "Tell me everything I need to know about what Cole might have filed. Right now." Quickly. She thought fast. He could see her doing it, cutting through everything, finding the essential shape of it. If he's trying to establish my incapacity or my absence, the most efficient filing would be a petition for temporary estate administration. He'd claim I am mentally unfit to manage my own affairs, or that I am missing and presumed unable to exercise my legal rights. Either way, he needs my father's signature on the supporting documents, and my father. She stopped. Her voice had gone tight. She pushed through it. My father may have already signed something. If Richard told him, it was routine paperwork. If Richard caught him on a bad day. How bad are his bad days? Bad enough. She met Caleb's eyes. Some days he doesn't know where he is. Some days he thinks it's 10 years ago. Some days he's completely himself. She swallowed. Richard has had 2 years to learn which days are which. Caleb absorbed that. Then he said, "The deed you're carrying, does that supersede a temporary administration petition?" She straightened slightly. "The original deed of estate, combined with my physical presence and my legal claim as direct heir, yes. It doesn't cancel the petition automatically, but it creates a competing claim that can't be resolved without a hearing. A hearing means time, and time means your father is still alive." Pause. The word landed between them. "Yes," she said quietly. He looked at her for a moment. "Let's go." The land office was a 2-story building on the main street, brick-faced, with the county seal above the door and a sign in the window that said it opened at 8 o'clock sharp. 7:43. They were not the only people waiting. Cole was already there. He was standing on the boardwalk across the street from the land office with 2 of his men, and he saw them the moment they turned the corner. He saw Caleb first. Caleb was taller, more visible, and then his eyes moved to Evelyn, and his expression did something complicated. It went through surprise. He had expected the main road. Caleb had been right, and then through calculation, and then it settled into something smooth and rehearsed. He crossed the street toward them. Caleb stepped slightly forward, not blocking Evelyn, just present. The way he had stood in the doorway the night before with the rifle across his chest. "Miss Whitmore." Cole addressed her directly, ignoring Caleb. "I'm relieved to see you're well. Your family has been desperately worried." Evelyn's voice was clear and perfectly level. "I'm sure they have. Arrange for a doctor to—" "I don't need a doctor." "Miss Whitmore, given my condition," she said, and the 2 words had an edge in them like a wire pulled tight, "is that of a woman whose carriage was deliberately driven into a drainage ditch by a man hired by my uncle. My condition is that of a woman whose documents were stolen. My condition, Mr. Cole, is that I am the legal heir to the Whitmore estate, and I am standing 12 feet from the county land office with my father's original deed of property. I suggest you choose your next words with considerable care." Cole looked at her. Then he looked at Caleb. Then he smiled that practiced empty smile. "Mr. Mercer," he said, "you understand that by inserting yourself into a family legal matter, you are exposing yourself to significant liability. Well, is a patient man, but he has lawyers who are not." Caleb said, "You have a small ranch in a valley where Mr. Well has considerable interests. I'd hate to see those interests become adversarial to me." "Are you threatening his land?" Evelyn's voice cut across Cole's like a blade. It's sharp, sudden, completely controlled. Because I want to make certain I understand correctly, so that I can describe this conversation accurately in a court document. Stopped. Evelyn stepped forward. She was shorter than Cole by half a head. And she was wearing a dress with a flannel patch on the shoulder, and she had a bruise on her cheekbone that was still faintly visible. And she looked at him as though he were something she had found at the bottom of a ledger that didn't add up. I know every document my uncle has filed in this county, she said. The petition he submitted yesterday. I know the 3 judges he has spoken to in the past 6 months. I know the land transfers he has attempted to reclassify. And I have written all of it down. She reached into her coat. She was wearing one of Caleb's old coats, too large for her. The sleeves rolled up and she produced the folded pages from the ledger. 8 pages of small, precise handwriting. Every name, every date, every amount. The full scope of what my uncle has done and what he intends to do. She held Cole's gaze. He was. So if you would like to continue threatening Mr. Mercer's property, please do so loudly. And please make sure everyone on this street can hear you. Because I would very much like witnesses. The street was not empty. 2 men had stopped on the boardwalk. A woman with a basket had slowed. The man who ran the hardware store across the way had come to stand in his doorway. Cole looked at his audience. He looked back at Evelyn. He said nothing. A clock somewhere in the building behind them struck 8. The door to the land office opened. Evelyn turned and walked in. Caleb followed her, and he did not look back at Cole, because looking back was not something the moment called for. The land office smelled like paper and ink, and the particular dry warmth of a room where records were kept. There was a long counter, and behind it a man was setting out papers and preparing his day medium height, thinning hair, the careful movements of someone who had been doing the same job for many years and had learned to love the orderliness of it. He looked up when they came in. He saw Evelyn. He stopped. Miss Whitmore, he said. His voice had something in it that was hard to read recognition, certainly. And underneath it, something else. Something that might have been relief or might have been dread. Mr. Warren, Evelyn said. Good morning. I'm here to file a competing claim of inheritance and to formally contest any petition for temporary administration of the Whitmore estate filed in the past 72 hours. Set down his papers. He looked at the door behind them involuntarily, just a flicker, and Caleb caught it. Expecting Cole, Caleb said quietly. Warren's eyes came back to him. I'm expecting everyone involved in this matter to have a great deal to say, and I would prefer to handle it by the law and nothing else. He straightened. Do you have documentation, Miss Whitmore? She set the deed on the counter and looked at it without touching it. Then he looked at her father's original deed. Yes. He is still living? Something crossed her face, fast, like a shadow of a bird crossing a field. Yes, he is still living. Warren nodded slowly. He pulled on a pair of spectacles and leaned over the deed without picking it up, reading it carefully. It was very quiet. Caleb stood slightly to the right of Evelyn, not hovering, not crowding her just there. Present. The way he had been present all morning, all week, in the doorway, on the trail, on the street outside. He watched Warren read. He watched the man's expression as he read. And he saw the moment Warren reached something, some line, some entry that made the man straighten up and look at Evelyn with an expression that had changed. Warren said carefully. I need to show you something. He turned to the files behind him and pulled a folder. He set it on the counter next to the deed and opened it. Evelyn looked at the top document. Caleb saw her face change. Not dramatic. She was not a dramatic person. He had learned that over 10 days. It was a tightening, a stillness, the kind of stillness that happens when something you feared is confirmed, and the confirmation is somehow worse than the fear because at least the fear could be wrong. What is that? Caleb asked. She said after a moment, it's a deed of transfer. Her voice was very quiet. Signed 6 days ago, transferring 51% of the Whitmore estate holdings to the Blackwell Land and Cattle Company. Your father signed it? Signed it? His signature is on it. She reached out and touched the paper at the bottom right corner, where the signature was. Finger rested on it for a moment. That is his signature. That is his handwriting. Her finger moved slightly. But that is not how he writes the last letter of his name. The last letter curves up. It has curved up for 40 years. My father taught me to write my own letters by showing me how he wrote his. She looked up at Warren. It curves down here. My father did not write this. Absolutely still. Warren looked at the signature. He looked at her. He looked at the deed she had brought. That, Caleb said quietly, is a forged signature. Took off his spectacles. He pressed two fingers to the bridge of his nose for a long moment. Mr. Warren, Evelyn said, had gone steady again, that deep, sure steadiness she found when things got worse. You have known my family for 30 years. You registered my father's original deed in this office. Signature. Warren put his spectacles back on. He looked at the transfer document again. He looked at the original deed. I would need a legal examiner to make a formal determination, he said slowly. You would, she said. Then I suggest we get one. Today, Miss Whitmore, the petition for temporary administration is based on fraudulent documents, she said, which is now on record because I have just made it part of the record in the presence of the county land clerk. She held his eyes. Please note the time and the date and what I have told you, Mr. I am formally contesting the transfer document on the grounds of signature forgery, and I am formally asserting my rights as the legal direct heir of Harold Whitmore under the original deed of estate dated 1871, and looked at her for a long moment. Then he reached under the counter and produced a large record book. Time is 8:12, he said. Date is the 19th of April, 1887. He dipped his pen. Miss Evelyn Whitmore, present in this office, formally contesting, opened. Cole walked in. He walked in with two men behind him, and a third man that Caleb had not seen before, older, in a dark suit, wearing a leather satchel with the deliberate care of someone who carried important things in it. That third man, Caleb realized, was a lawyer. Cole looked at the record book open on the counter. He looked at Warren's pen in the air. He looked at Evelyn. Actus' smile was completely gone. Mr. Warren, he said, I would ask you to stop what you're doing. I'm afraid I can't do that, Mr. Cole, Warren said, and his voice had found something in it that hadn't been there a minute ago. Something that sounded like a man deciding which side of a line he was standing on. Miss Whitmore has initiated a formal contest, and I am required by the laws of this territory to record it. Cole stepped forward. That woman is the subject of a petition of mental incapacity. Which petition, Warren said without looking up from his record book, was filed yesterday. Documentation that Miss Whitmore has just formally alleged to contain a forged signature. He dipped his pen again. Suggests, Mr. Cole, that you consult with your lawyer about what that means for the petition standing. The lawyer, Caleb, saw it. The quick sideways turn, the low, rapid words. Expression shifted. He said something back, short and quiet. Cole turned back to the room. He looked at Caleb. You understand what you've done, he said. Loud, it was very quiet, which was worse. Caleb looked at him. I drove a neighbor to the land office. Mr. Blackwell will not consider you a neighbor. Mr. Blackwell can consider me whatever he likes, Caleb said. This is a public building, and she had every right to come here. His eyes moved to Evelyn. This isn't finished, she agreed. It isn't, not even close. She looked at him with those dark, sharp, tired eyes. It has started, and it has started in writing in the county record in front of witnesses. And that, Mr. Cole, is something you cannot unfile. Cole held her gaze for a moment longer. Then he turned and walked out. The lawyer followed. One of the riders followed. The other one lingered for a moment in the doorway. He was looking at Caleb, and Caleb looked back at him with the same steady expression he had used the night before in the cabin doorway. And the man left, closed. The room was quiet again. Warren finished writing. He blotted the page. He looked up at Evelyn over his spectacles. I will need to hold both documents pending the examination, he said. the original deed, and the transfer document. Of course, she said. The examination could take 3 to 5 days, I understand. And he looked at her carefully. Miss Whitmore, do you have somewhere safe to stay while this is resolved? Given the circumstances. I looked at Caleb. Caleb said she does. Warren nodded once. He began to carefully folder the documents. Then he stopped. Miss Whitmore. He said her name differently this time. Lower. Like a man about to say something that cost him something. I should tell you because I think you should know, and because your father deserves someone to say it. I looked at that transfer document when Cole filed it yesterday. He paused. I looked at the signature. Evelyn stood very still. I have been looking at your father's signature on documents in this office for 30 years, Warren said. And yesterday afternoon I looked at that signature for quite a long time. He met her eyes. I am glad you came this morning. It was the most he could say. She understood it. Thank you, Mr. Warren, she said. They walked out into the street. The morning had come on fully now. Hawthorne was awake around them, people moving, horses, the sounds of a working town going about its business, indifferent to the thing that had just happened in the land office behind them. Caleb stopped on the boardwalk and looked up the street and then down it. Sign of Cole or his men. Gone for now. Thinking, planning, reporting back to Richard Blackwell. We bought time, Evelyn said. She was standing beside him, looking at the same street. 3 to 5 days for the examination. If the examiner confirms the forgery, when he confirms it, she glanced at him. Warren already knew, Caleb said. He said so. He just needed someone to say it first so it was on record and not just his private opinion. When the examiner looks at it, he'll confirm it. He paused. What happens then? Then the transfer document is voided. A petition for temporary administration collapses without its supporting documents. She thought through it. Richard will still have the political connections, the lawyers, the resources to fight it. It won't end quickly. There will be hearings. There will be challenges. She looked at the street. But the original deed will be the governing document. And with my father still living, the estate is still his. She stopped after. The word hung there. Caleb said quietly, "It's yours." She nodded. Just once. He looked at her, at the flannel patch on her shoulder, at the bruise that was almost gone, at the 8 pages of notes folded inside his coat, the document she had written by candlelight while he slept in a chair, operation of a woman who had been fighting this fight in her head for months before it came to a head on a dark road in a drainage ditch. You knew this was coming, he said. Not the accident specifically, but this, all of it. I knew Richard was moving faster, she said. I knew I had to get to the county record before he filed. Trying to get here. She paused. I just didn't expect to lose 2 days. Because of the ditch. Because of the ditch. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, you could have told me. Any of this. Few days. She looked at him. Would you have believed me? He thought about it, honestly. I'd have believed you were in trouble. The rest of it, he considered. I don't know. Maybe not right away. Exactly, she said. I needed you to see me first, before you knew what I was attached to. She looked at him steadily. People change when they know about the estate. They always change. The way they look at you, the way they talk to you, the things they ask for. Everything becomes about the estate, and nothing is about the person. She paused. First, you treated me like a person first. I needed that to happen before anything else. Caleb was quiet. That's why you asked me to lift that bail myself, she said. Even though it was going to hurt, he almost smiled. I knew you'd do it wrong, and I knew you needed to learn it right. Because you treated me like someone who was going to be here long enough to need to know. He didn't answer that directly. He said, we should get back to the ranch. Cole knows where it is, and he knows we left it empty. She nodded. Yes. They started back toward Miller's stable. They were halfway down the side street when Evelyn said, without stopping, without looking at him, Caleb, when this is over, when the examination is done and the claim is established, Richard Blackwell is going to come here himself. Caleb kept walking. I know, he won't come like Cole came. Cole is a messenger. Richard is different. He is the kind of man who comes in person when he wants to make sure something is done completely. What does that mean? She was quiet for a beat. It means he will offer you things. Money first. He is very good at finding the number that changes a person's mind. She looked at Caleb sideways as they walked. And if the money doesn't work, then what? Then he finds another way. She paused. He always finds another way. Caleb stopped walking. She stopped with him. He turned to look at her. You said in the land office about Richard finding that number that changes a person's mind. He held her eyes. I want you to hear me say this now before he gets here. He makes his offer and tries to make it sound reasonable and finds the version of it that's most difficult to refuse. She looked at him. There is no number, he said. You understand? There isn't a number. She looked at him for a long moment. Something moved in her expression that she didn't try to hide or control. Something that was not about the estate or the lawyers or the forged document or the 3 to 5 days or any of it. Something simpler and older and more fundamental than all of it. I know, she said softly. Good, he said. Then let's get the horses. They walked the rest of the way to Miller's stable, and behind them on the main street of Hawthorne, inside the land office, Daniel Warren was writing in his record book in his careful hand, noting the time and the date and the nature of the formal contest, creating the document that would begin to unravel 2 years of careful, patient theft. And in Billings, the telegraph office was receiving a message, and the man who received it read it twice, set it on his desk, and reached for his coat. Richard Blackwell had read enough. He was done sending messengers. He was coming himself. Richard Blackwell arrived on a Thursday. Caleb knew he was coming before he saw him. He felt it the way a man who has spent years reading weather feels a storm coming not through any single sign, but through the accumulation of small things that didn't sit right. The way the Aldrich hands stopped showing up on the county road. The way no one from town rode past the ranch for 2 full days. The way the valley got quiet in a manner that wasn't peaceful, but was instead the quiet of things holding their breath. He was mending the north fence when he heard the horses, not the rough road scramble of Cole's men riding fast in the dark. Something else, measured, deliberate. The sound of men who had all the time in the world because they believed the outcome was already decided. He set down the wire and walked to the front of the property. He was. There were 5 of them, 4 riders flanking a 5th man in the center, and the 5th man was the kind of man that Caleb had seen a few times in his life, the kind that wore authority the way other men wore coats. Natural was, without effort, without needing to announce it, 50, broad through the chest, with a face that had been handsome once and had hardened into something more functional and considerably more dangerous. He rode a horse that cost more than everything Caleb owned. He pulled up at the gate and looked at Caleb with the patient, appraising expression of a man who had already calculated the distance between them and found it unimpressive. He said, Mr. Blackwell. Caleb said, a pause. Blackwell's eyes moved over the ranch, the cabin, the cattle visible in the east pasture with the same brief, efficient inventory that Cole had attempted. At the beginning of all of this, except that where Cole's inventory had been about assessment, Blackwell's was about ownership. He looked at things the way a man looks at things he has already decided belong to him. I'll come straight to it, Blackwell said. I respect a working man's time. Appreciate that. My niece is on your property. She's a guest, Caleb said. She is a young woman with a documented history of emotional instability who has placed herself in a situation that is dangerous for everyone involved, including you. Blackwell said it the way a doctor reports a diagnosis with the particular authority of someone who has said a thing so many times it has become, in their telling, simply true. I have no quarrel with you, Mr. Mercer. You found her injured, and you helped her. That speaks well of your character. But the time for that help has passed. She doesn't seem to think so. She rarely thinks clearly in these situations. Of the documented condition. Caleb looked at him steadily. What condition is that exactly? Anxiety, delusion, a tendency to construct elaborate narratives about persecution. Blackwell's voice was smooth, careful, and utterly convincing. That was the thing about it. It was not the voice of a man who was lying badly. It was the voice of a man who had told this particular lie so many times and to so many people that it had acquired the texture of truth. She has required professional management for the better part of 3 years. I have done my best for her, as her family. Her family, Caleb said. That's right. The family that had her driver run her carriage into a drainage ditch. The smooth surface of Blackwell's expression didn't crack. It didn't even flex. Chester was a hired driver who panicked during an accident. Whatever Evelyn has told you about his intentions, I would ask you to consider the source. Caleb said nothing. Blackwell reached inside his coat and produced an envelope. He held it out, and one of his riders moved forward and extended it toward Caleb across the gate. Caleb didn't take it. $500, Blackwell said. Your trouble, for your time, for the inconvenience of a situation you were unfortunate enough to become involved in. He paused. And my personal assurance that the Aldrich grazing matter will be resolved in your favor without the need for lawyers or hearings. You'll have that money back and a letter clearing the obligation before the month is out. $500. Caleb stood very still. $500 was more money than he had seen in 3 years combined. $500 was the herd rebuilt, the wagon fixed, the cabin sealed properly against the winter. A new contract with a fair broker, a real chance. $500 was the version of this ranch that he had been trying to build since the beginning and failing at, for reasons he had only just begun to understand. $500 and the Aldrich money back. He stood there and felt the weight of it the way you feel the weight of something you could pick up if you chose to. He looked at the envelope. He looked at Blackwell, and it's not something you trade when the price is high enough, he said. Well, looked at him. For the first time, something moved behind those flat, appraising eyes. Eyes exactly. More like a recalculation. Mr. Sir, she told me you'd come, Caleb said. She told me you'd have a number. She told me you were good at finding the number that changes a person's mind. He kept his voice level and his eyes steady. Right about the number. She was right about you being good at it. He paused. Wrong about what it would do. Blackwell looked at him for a long moment. The envelope was still in his rider's hand, extended across the gate, and the rider was beginning to look uncomfortable holding it. You're making a serious mistake, Blackwell said. His voice had not changed in temperature or volume. That was what made it frightening. A man who shouted his threats was a man using emotion. A man who delivered them in a tone of patient fact was a man who believed them completely. Reach in this territory extends well past Barrow Creek. The Aldrich family, the Prentice operation, the banking arrangements for half the ranches in this valley. These are relationships I have built over 20 years. I can make this a very difficult place for a man like you to operate, Caleb said, or we'll both. Caleb nodded once slowly. Then I guess we both know where we stand. Blackwell looked at him for another moment. Then he turned his horse. His riders followed. The man with the envelope tucked back inside his coat without expression. They rode toward the road. And then Blackwell stopped, horseback, just halfway. So he was looking at Caleb over his shoulder. My niece, he said, is going to lose this fight. The examiner in Hawthorne is a man named Pruitt, Arthur Pruitt. He has been doing business with my lawyers for 11 years. He said it simply, without heat, the way you state a fact about geography. Whatever Warren recorded, whatever documents she filed, Pruitt's report will reflect the appropriate findings. And without the examination supporting her claim, the contest collapses. He let that land. You might want to tell her that, before she invests more hope than she can afford to lose. He rode out. Caleb stood at the gate and watched them go, and he did not move until the sound of the hooves had faded completely off the road, and walked to the cabin fast. Evelyn was inside. She had heard all of it. The window was cracked, the same window she had listened through when Cole came, and she had not pretended otherwise when he came back in. She was sitting at the table. Hands were flat on the surface, very still. Face was doing the thing it did when she was working through something difficult, not blank, not closed, but intensely interior, behind frosted glass. Caleb said, I heard. Is it true? Does Blackwell have him? She was quiet for a moment. Arthur Pruitt has been the county land examiner for 9 years, technically competent, and he values his position very much. She paused. If Richard has approached him, if Richard has made the same kind of arrangement with Pruitt that he's made with judges and clerks and brokers throughout this territory, then yes. Pruitt's report will say whatever Richard needs it to say. The Caleb sat down. The two axle bolts were on the windowsill where they had been since February. He looked at them for a moment. Then what do we do? She looked up at him. We need another examiner. Can we get one in time? The county law allows a contesting party to request an independent examination if they can demonstrate reasonable cause to doubt the county examiner's impartiality. She said it from memory, the way she said everything legal from a place in her mind where she had already walked through it multiple times before arriving at the conversation. Reasonable cause includes documented financial relationships between the examiner and the opposing party. And you can document that between Pruitt and Blackwell's lawyers. I know it exists. Whether I can prove it in 3 days, she stopped. The ledger pages, the ones I wrote at the cabin, about them. I listed every business arrangement I know Richard to have in this territory. Every name, every connection. She straightened. Is Pruitt's name on those pages? Caleb reached into his coat and pulled out the folded pages. He put them on the table between them, and they both leaned over them. Evelyn's finger moved down the lines of her own handwriting, reading fast. She stopped. Her finger was resting on a line about 2/3 down the 4th page. Caleb read it over her shoulder. A land transaction from 2 years prior. A parcel in the Northern Valley, below market value by its owner, a man named Pruitt, to a company that was, through 2 layers of business names, a subsidiary of the Blackwell operation. He sold Richard land, Caleb said, at 40 cents on the dollar. Evelyn said, which means Richard paid him the difference in some other form, which means there is a financial relationship. She looked up, which means we have reasonable cause. Who do we take this to? Warren records. He can't adjudicate, she thought rapidly. Alderton. You asked me about him in Hawthorne and I wasn't sure where he stood. She met Caleb's eyes. I need to find out. How? She was already standing. I need to write a letter right now, tonight. She looked at him. Was. And I need someone to write it to Alderton's house personally. Mail, hand delivery tonight. Caleb stood up. Write it. Caleb, it's 15 miles to Alderton's house and Richard's men are... I'll write it, he said, again. He was already moving toward the door. Write the letter. She looked at him for half a second, that look she had, the one that was always recalibrating him upward from whatever estimate she had previously made, and then she sat back down and picked up the pencil. She wrote for 20 minutes. He had the horse ready when she came out with the folded letter, sealed with a drop of candle wax pressed with her thumb. Tell him, she started. Tell him what's in the letter, Caleb said. So he can't pretend he didn't understand it. She handed him the letter. Their hands were both on it for a moment. Be careful, she said. He rode. The 15 miles to Judge Alderton's house took him an hour and 20 minutes on the good horse, and he arrived at 9:30 at night to find the judge's house lit up. Someone was awake. He rode to the front, tied his horse, and knocked. The man who answered the door was 70-ish, lean, with the kind of face that had spent decades making decisions about other people's lives and had learned to keep its own counsel. He looked at Caleb with the careful, unhurried attention of a man who had learned long ago that who came to your door at 9:30 at night was never random. Alderton, Caleb said. My name is Caleb Mercer. I have a letter for you from Evelyn Whitmore. Alderton looked at him. Then he opened the door wider. Come in, Mr. Mercer. The Caleb came in. He said what there was to say, not all of it, but the shape of it. The accident, the deed, the filing in Hawthorne, transfer document with the forged signature, Blackwell's visit that afternoon, and he laid it out plainly, and he did not exaggerate, and he did not editorialize. He just told it. Alderton listened without interrupting. He read the letter twice. He set it on the table in front of him and looked at it for a moment. I married Harold Whitmore and his wife in 1857, he said. And 2 years later, I have known that child her entire life. He looked up at Caleb. I have also known Richard Blackwell for 15 years, and I have watched, over the past 2 years, with considerable discomfort, the way he has maneuvered around Harold's illness. He paused. I was not certain enough to act. I was not in possession of sufficient documentation to justify intervention. And now, Caleb asked. Alderton tapped the letter with one finger. Now I am in possession of a formal allegation of signature forgery, a documented financial relationship between the county examiner and the opposing party, and a formal contest filed with the county record. He looked at Caleb steadily. I am in possession of something else. What? That Harold Whitmore is not going to live much longer. His voice was even, but something beneath it was not. And that what happens in the next 72 hours may be the last thing I can do for a man I have called a friend for 30 years. He stood up. I will ride to Hawthorne tomorrow morning. I will request a stay of the examination pending review of the examiner's impartiality. And I will appoint an independent examiner myself under my judicial authority if I find sufficient cause. Caleb stood. Thank you, Judge. Alderton looked at him. He carried her in from the road. Yes, sir. Harold Whitmore raised that girl by himself after her mother passed. He used to bring her to court proceedings when she was 8 years old so she could watch how the law worked. The old judge's voice had something in it now that it hadn't had at the beginning of the conversation. She used to sit in the gallery and take notes with a little pencil she kept in her coat pocket. Caleb thought of 8 pages of small, precise handwriting filled in by candlelight. I believe that, he said. He rode back to the ranch, arrived after midnight, and found Evelyn awake at the table, where she always was, in the pre-dawn or the late night, with coffee or without it, working through the shape of things. She looked up when he came in. He said, Alderton is going to Hawthorne in the morning. Closed her eyes. Just for a moment. Just long enough. When she opened them, she said, did he believe you? He believed the letter. And he knew you. He said you used to sit in his courtroom with a pencil. Something moved across her face, soft and sudden and completely unguarded. The way things move across a person's face when they are blindsided by a memory of something good in the middle of something hard. She looked down at the table for a moment. He let me look at the case records, she said quietly. I was 10. He told my father that a mind like mine shouldn't be kept away from how things actually work. She paused. My father thought it was unusual for a girl. Alderton told him that unusual was not the same as wrong. She looked up. I hadn't thought about that in years. Caleb sat down. He was tired the way you are tired when the adrenaline of a hard ride finally leaves your body and takes the last of your energy with it. He rubbed his face with both hands. There's something else, he said. She waited. He lowered his hands and looked at her. When I was riding back coming through the north stretch, about 4 miles from here, I passed 2 riders on the road, coming from the direction of town, moving slow, watching, eyes sharpened. Cole's men? I don't know whose men, but they weren't out at that hour for any innocent reason. He paused. They know Alderton is involved now, or they will by morning. Blackwell has people everywhere, you said that yourself. She was quiet, thinking. If Richard gets to Alderton before the morning, didn't seem like a man who gets gotten to, Caleb said. Richard is very persuasive. So was the letter you wrote. He met her eyes. I watched the judge read it twice, and I watched his face while he read it. He paused. Whatever Blackwell can offer Alderton is 70 years old, and he has been sitting in judgment of other men's choices his entire adult life. The thing that happens to men like that, they start to think about their own choices. The ones that will be left behind after they're gone. He looked at her steadily. Alderton is thinking about what kind of choice this one is. She looked at him for a long moment. You're very good at reading people, she said. A man who claims to keep to himself. I didn't say I keep to myself. I said I keep my own counsel. Is there a difference? Keeping to yourself means you don't engage. Keeping your own counsel means you engage, and then you think about it privately before you say anything. He almost smiled. I've been thinking privately for 35 years. I've got a lot stored up. She almost laughed. It wasn't a full laugh. The situation was too close, too fragile, too dependent on things they couldn't control for a full laugh. It was the edge of one, and it was the first time he had heard it, and it did something to the room. Made it warmer, made the thin walls of the cabin feel less thin. Then her expression shifted back. "The riders you saw on the road," she said. "I know. If they're watching the property, I know, Evelyn." She looked at him. "I'm sorry," she said, and it came out differently than he expected. Not apologetic formal, the way she spoke when she was being careful. Just real. "I'm sorry for what I pulled you into. I knew what it might cost you, and She stopped. "You needed help," he said. "Yes, but you didn't know the full extent of..." "It wouldn't have changed anything," he said. "Simple." "True." She looked at him for a long moment across the table. She asked, "Why wouldn't it have changed anything?" "I had nothing to offer you. I was a stranger. I had no proof of who I was. I could have been..." "You were bleeding in a ditch," he said. "Everything else came after that." She was quiet. "And then you showed me my own contracts," he said. "And then you stayed." He looked at her. People who stay are rare. She opened her mouth and closed it. Outside, the night was quiet. Whatever was moving on the road was moving quietly now, or had moved on. The cattle were calm. In the pasture he could hear them, the low occasional sound of them settling, which was a good sign. Animals knew before people did when something was wrong. "Some sleep," he said. "You too." "In a while." He stayed up. He sat in his chair by the fire, and he thought about the riders on the road and about Blackwell's voice, that flat, patient, "I have already decided" voice, and about Alderton, 70 years old, reading a letter by lamplight and tapping it with one finger and saying, "I was not certain enough to act." He thought about what it meant to be certain enough. He thought about the night he had found her, the breath he had heard in the dark, wet, and shallow, the breath of someone for whom breathing had become work. It was the moment he had moved toward it before he had finished deciding to. That was what certainty enough felt like. Not a calculation, not a weighing of costs, just a movement towards something that needed to be moved toward. He fell asleep in the chair around 2 in the morning. He woke up to someone pounding on the cabin door, not politely, not with the measured knock of someone who respected the hour. Pounding, urgent, the kind of knock that made your heart move before your mind understood why. He was at the door in 3 steps. He opened it. A boy 14, 15, the Miller stable hands from town, breathing hard, his horse steaming behind him like he had ridden it fast. "Sir," the boy said. "Mr. Warren sent me. He said to come fast." He gulped a breath. "He said to tell Miss Whitmore another breath. He said they're moving up the examination. First light. Pruitt's been told to file his report before 8 o'clock. Caleb stared at him. "Before 8? Evelyn's voice came from behind him, already awake, already standing. "Yes, ma'am," said. He didn't know how to stop it, but he wanted you to know. The boy looked between them. He said to tell you he's sorry. He said he tried." Caleb turned to Evelyn. Her face was pale. The calculation was happening behind her eyes at a speed he could almost hear. "If Pruitt files before 8, she said, her voice very controlled, "Alderton gets to the office. The impartiality challenge is on records." "Then the report stands," Caleb said. "Then the report stands and the contest fails and Richard has everything." She looked at him. The pail had gone. Something harder had replaced it. "We have to get to Hawthorne before first light. That's 2 hours from now. Then we need to ride in 1. She was already moving for her coat. To the boy, "Go back to Miller's. Tell him I need both horses ready in 5 minutes. Tell him I'll pay him back for the favor." The boy nodded and ran. Caleb turned back. Evelyn was pulling on his old coat, the too large one with the rolled sleeves, and she had the deed in her hand and the ledger pages folded and inside the coat's front pocket. She looked at him. "If we get there in time," she said, "and Alderton is there, and the challenge goes on record before Pruitt files," Caleb said. "And if we don't get there in time?" He looked at her. "Then we try something else." She held his eyes. "Isn't something else, Caleb? This is it. This is the only window." "I know," he said. "So let's not miss it." He held the door open. She walked through it, And he followed, and they ran for the stable in the dark. And 12 miles of road between them and everything. And somewhere ahead, the first pale edge of dawn was beginning to separate the sky from the land. And Richard Blackwell's instructions were already moving through the machinery he had spent 2 years building. And a man named Arthur Pruitt was lighting his lamp and opening his office early and pulling out the documents that what was in the Whitmore inheritance before the rest of Hawthorne finished its morning coffee. Unless two people on tired horses reached the land office first. They rode like the ground was on fire beneath them. They made it in 53 minutes. Caleb pushed the horse harder than he had ever pushed an animal he cared about, and the horse gave him everything it had, and Evelyn on the bay matched him stride for stride without being asked. They came out of the cattle trail behind the feed mill, with the sky just beginning to go gray at the edges, not light yet, not fully, but the dark thinning in the way that said light was coming, whether anyone was ready for it or not. They tied the horses at Miller's post. The man was already up, already watching from his stable doorway like he had been expecting them, because the boy had done his job and they ran. Not walked fast, ran. Evelyn ran in Caleb's too large coat, with the deed pressed flat against her chest with one hand and her other arm pumping, and she ran like a woman who had spent the past 2 weeks learning what it felt like to fight for something with her whole body instead of just her mind. Caleb ran beside her and didn't tell her to slow down because there was no version of this where slowing down was the right answer. The land office was lit up from inside. That was the first thing Caleb saw as they turned onto the main street, the lamp burning in the window of the land office, which meant Pruitt was already there, which meant they had less time than he had hoped and more urgency than he had let himself admit. Second thing he saw was Alderton's horse tied at the post outside. He grabbed Evelyn's arm, and she looked at the horse and then at him, and he saw relief move through her face like a wave fast, complete, and then gone, by the focused intensity of someone who knew the fight wasn't over just because the cavalry had arrived. They went through the door. The scene inside the land office was the kind of scene that happens when two forces of equal conviction arrive at the same place with opposite intentions. Was behind the counter, standing very straight, book open in front of him, and his pen in his hand, and his face wearing the expression of a man who has decided which side of the line he is on and intends to stay there regardless of the cost. And Alderton was to Warren's left, standing with the particular stillness of a man whose authority came not from his volume, but from his 70 years of exercising. Across the counter from both of them, a lean, gray-haired man with round spectacles and a leather satchel open on the counter. Pruitt was looking at the scene with an expression that had started as impatience and was currently in the process of becoming something closer to fear. Cole was there too, standing to Pruitt's right, and when the door opened and Caleb and Evelyn walked in, his eyes went directly to Evelyn the way a man's eyes go to the thing he has been told to prevent. Every person in the room went still for exactly 1 second. Then Alderton said without turning his head, "Miss Whitmore, you made good time, Judge." She crossed the room to the counter, breathing hard from the run, and she set the deed on the counter next to Warren's record book. "Has he filed?" "Not yet," Warren said. And there was something in his voice, a compressed relief, a man who had been stalling and was grateful to no longer need to. "Mr. Pruitt arrived 20 minutes ago. I have been explaining to him the procedural requirements for filing an examination report under contested conditions." "No such requirements," Pruitt said. His voice was tight and professional, and about 60% as confident as he was trying to make it sound. "An examination report is a factual document. It does not require special procedural handling." "It does," Alderton said, in the tone of a man stating the color of the sky, "when the examining party's impartiality has been formally challenged under territorial statute." He turned to look at Pruitt fully now, and Pruitt straightened involuntarily. Under that look the way people straighten, under the attention of someone whose judgment they have spent years trying to avoid. "Mr. Pruitt, I am going to ask you a question, and I am going to ask you to answer it carefully, because yours will become part of the official record that Mr. currently maintaining." He paused. In the past 36 months, have you conducted any financial transactions with any entity owned by or affiliated with Richard Blackwell or the Blackwell Land and Cattle Company? And was absolutely silent. Pruitt's mouth opened. Cole said, "Judge, I must object. You are not an attorney of record in this proceeding, Mr. Alderton said, without looking at him. You have no standing to object to anything." He kept his eyes on Pruitt. Right? "The question is, on the record, I will need an answer." Looked at Cole. That look, that single sideways look, that involuntary reaching for instruction from the man who had sent him here was itself an answer. Everyone in the room saw it. Warren's pen was moving. I've had some incidental business dealings." Pruitt started. "Incidental," Alderton repeated. "Parcel of land in the Northern Valley, sold in 1885 to a company called the Montana Territorial Holdings Group, which is a registered subsidiary of the Blackwell Land and Cattle Company, approximately 40% below the assessed market value." He turned to Evelyn. "Miss Whitmore, is this documented in your record?" She pulled the ledger pages from inside her coat. She found the line she knew exactly where it was. She had read those pages 100 times in her head on the ride, and she set the paper on the counter with her finger on the entry and leaned over and read it. He looked up at Alderton. He nodded. "Documented," Warren said. "Entered into the record." Professional composure was coming apart at the seams in the precise, terrible way that things come apart when they were never as solid as they appeared. He looked at the ledger page. He looked at Alderton. And he looked at Cole again. And Cole's face had gone into the blank, closed expression of a man who has just understood that the situation has moved past what he was authorized to handle. "Mr. Pruitt," Alderton said, "under territorial statute, Section 42, paragraphs 7, an examination conducted by a party with a documented financial relationship to the opposing party in a contested inheritance proceeding is void and without legal standing. I am exercising my judicial authority to suspend your examination pending appointment of an independent examiner." He turned to Warren. "Please note the suspension in the record." "Noted," Warren said, and wrote it. The Cole stepped forward. "Judge Alderton, Mr. Blackwell will..." "Mr. Blackwell," Alderton said, and now there was something in his voice that had not been there before, something that had been building for 70 years and had finally found the exact right moment to arrive, "will be receiving a formal judicial notice within the hour. The status of the petition for temporary administration, the suspension of the examination, and the appointment of independent review." He looked at Cole with the full weight of 7 decades of standing in judgment of other people's choices. "And I would suggest very strongly that Mr. Blackwell retain the best lawyer he can afford, because the forged signature on the transfer document that was filed in this office 3 days ago constitutes criminal fraud in the Montana Territory, and I intend to see that addressed through the appropriate channels with or without his cooperation." Cole did not say anything else. The room held its breath. And then Cole picked up his satchel, and he walked to the door, and he opened it, and he left. His footsteps crossed the boardwalk outside and faded into the morning sounds of Hawthorne waking up around them, indifferent and ordinary and entirely unaware of what had just been decided inside that building. Pruitt gathered his papers from the counter with shaking hands. He did not look at anyone. He put his satchel over his arm, and he walked to the door, and he stopped with his hand on the frame, and he turned to Alderton, and he said in a voice that had gone very small, "I didn't know what was in the documents. He told me it was a standard estate transfer. He told me the family had agreed." Alderton looked at him for a long moment. "That is something you can explain to the review board," he said. "I suggest you do so completely and truthfully. It will go considerably better for you if you do." Left. The door closed, and then it was just the 4 of them, Caleb, Evelyn, Warren, and Alderton in the quiet land office with the lamp burning and the record book open and the gray morning light beginning to come through the windows. He set down his pen. He looked at Evelyn. He said very simply, "It's on the record, Miss Whitmore." She put both hands flat on the counter. She was breathing steadily, but her knuckles were white. She looked the record book and she looked the original deed that she had carried on her person since she left home. And she looked at the 8 pages of notes written by candlelight in a cabin with a gap in the north wall. She said, "What happens now?" Alderton came around the counter. He stood in front of her the way a man stands in front of someone he has known since she was 8 years old and sat in his courtroom taking notes with a small pencil. Now, he said, "The independent examiner reviews the transfer document and confirms the forgery. It will take 3 days, perhaps 4. The petition for temporary administration is suspended pending that review. The original deed of estate remains the governing document." He paused. "And when the review is complete, and it will confirm what we all already know, the petition collapses or is voided. The estate reverts to its rightful heir under the original deed." He looked at her. "Under you, Evelyn." She stood very still. "And my father?" she asked. Alderton's expression changed, just slightly. The way a doctor's expression changes when a patient asks the question the doctor has been waiting to answer and dreading in equal measure. "I received a message last evening," he said quietly. Dr. Harmon in Billings. Your father has taken a turn. Dr. Harmon believes the time is short." He held her eyes. "I think you should go to him, Evelyn, as soon as you can." The silence in the room, after he said that, was different from all the other silences. It had no strategy in it, no calculation, no next move. The silence of a daughter who had been fighting for weeks to protect something her father built, hearing that the man himself was running out of time. Caleb did not look away from her face. He watched her absorb it. He watched her hold it. He watched her do the thing he had seen her do every time something landed hard. The one breath, the straightening, the returning to herself from whatever place the blow had sent her. This time, something was different. This time, after the breath and the straightening, she turned and looked at him. Warren or Alderton, at him. He said nothing. He just looked back. She said, "I need to go to Billings." "Yes," he said, "that's 4 hours by horse. Longer by road if it's a morning stage from Hawthorne," Warren said, quietly, from behind the counter. 7. Goes directly to Billings. He paused. "It's 6:42 now." She looked at Caleb. He looked at Warren. "Does it stop?" "Once. 20 minutes in Clearwater." Caleb put his hand in his coat pocket, empty. He had given Miller his last $4 at the stable. He looked at Alderton. Alderton already had his hand in his own coat. He produced 2 folded bills and set them on the counter without ceremony. "Stage fare," he said simply, "and a little for Billings." Evelyn looked at the money. She looked at Alderton. Something moved across her face that was not quite crying and not quite not crying. The expression of someone who has been carrying something very heavy alone for a very long time and has just had someone reach out and take part of the weight without being asked. "Thank you," she said. The words were quiet and they were real, and they carried 30 years of a judge letting a small girl sit in his courtroom and take notes. She picked up the money. She picked up the deed. She started for the door. She stopped. She turned back. She looked at Caleb. He was standing where she had left him, his hands loose at his sides, his coat dusty from the ride, thumbnail, and his calloused hands, and his steady, quiet face that she had been reading for 3 weeks and still found new things in. "Me," she said. He opened his mouth. "Don't argue," she said. "And don't tell me you have cattle to tend." "I know you have cattle to tend." Anyway." He looked at her for a long moment. "All right," he said. They made the stage with 4 minutes to spare, and to Billings took 3 hours minutes, 4 minutes, and they sat across from each other in the narrow stage with 2 other passengers who fell asleep before Clearwater, and the world moved past outside the windows. And for the first time in 3 weeks, there was nothing that required immediate action. No contracts to read, no riders at the gate, no letters to write by candlelight, roads to navigate before dawn. Just the movement of the stage and the sound of the horses, and the 2 of them, awake in the space between what had been and what was coming next. She talked about her father, not the estate, not the legal situation, not what came after. She talked about the man. She talked about the way he used to read to her on Sunday mornings. Not books, but real books he thought she could reach toward. instance, she talked about the day he took her to the land office in Billings for the first time and explained every document on the wall and told her that understanding the law was the best protection a person could have. She talked about his handwriting, the way the last letter of his name curved upward, that distinctive upward curve that she had learned by watching his hand move across paper when she was 6 years old, and that Richard Blackwell had not known about when he forged the signature because he had never paid enough attention to her father and to notice the small, true details of him. And Caleb listened the way he always listened, fully, without interrupting, without performing sympathy, just present. When she ran out of words for a while, she looked out the window. He looked at her profile, the bruise entirely gone now, her face back to what it actually was, which was sharp and strong, and in this moment very tired and very young. What was he like, Caleb asked, before he got sick? She didn't hesitate. Enormous, she said. Not physically. He was actually quite slight. But the space he took up in a room, the way people leaned toward him when he talked, he had this quality of making you feel that whatever you had to say was the most important thing he was going to hear that day. She paused. He made everyone feel that. It wasn't a performance. He actually believed it. He was actually that interested in people. That's where you get it, Caleb said. She looked at him. The way you read rooms, the way you pay attention. He held her eyes, it from watching him. She was quiet for a moment. I never thought about it that way. Most people don't think about where they got their best qualities. They just have them and they use them. He paused. Father gave you the tools that kept you alive these past 3 weeks. Seems worth knowing that. She looked at him for a long moment. The stage hit a rut and jolted them both, and the 2 sleeping passengers didn't stir. And outside the window, the valley was giving way to the wider plain that led to Billings. Are you? So she stopped. What? Good, she said. And she said it simply, without irony or decoration. Are you so good, Caleb? I have met a great many people in my life. I have met people with power and people with money and people who were very clever and people who were very educated. And in 3 weeks on a ranch with no money and a broken wagon, I have met someone who is, she stopped again. I don't have the right word for it. He thought about it. My mother would have said, principally said. My father would have said stubborn. He almost smiled. Probably both are accurate. Neither is the word I was looking for, she said. It's the word you were looking for. She looked at him. Safe, she said quietly. You make people feel safe. Not because you're large or because you have a rifle or because you can threaten someone into leaving, but because when you say you're going to do something, you do it. And when you say something is true, it is. She paused. That is extraordinarily rare, Caleb. I want you to know that. He looked at her without speaking for a moment. Then you make people feel capable, he said. You look at someone and you see what they could do if they understood what they were actually dealing with. You showed me my own contracts, and you didn't make me feel stupid for not understanding them. You made me feel like understanding them was something I could learn. He paused. That's also extraordinarily rare. The stage slowed as Billings came into view. They looked at each other. 3 weeks ago, she had been a stranger in a ditch. He had been a man with 2 axle bolts on his windowsill and 14 head of cattle and contracts he had signed without understanding them. The distance between that moment and this one felt simultaneously enormous and very small, like looking at a mountain you have just climbed and being surprised by how close the top is to the bottom when you see them both at once. They found Dr. Harmon's address from the stage driver, who knew everyone in Billings, and they walked to the house on Clement Street where Harold Whitmore had been staying under medical care for the past 6 weeks. Dr. Harmon was a compact, serious man who met them at the door and looked at Evelyn with an expression that was careful and honest in equal measure. He's been asking for you, Harmon said, since yesterday morning. He's been more himself today than he has been in some time. That sometimes happens near the end. A clarity. He paused. I want you to be prepared for what you'll see. I'm prepared, she said. She was not, of course. No one ever is. But she walked through the door with her back straight and her hands steady, and Caleb followed her at the distance that said he was there without crowding the space that needed to belong to her and her father. The room was warm and quiet. Whitmore was a small man, as she had described, slight, with the careful hands of a man who had spent his life working with documents and deeds, a face that even now, even reduced by illness to something spare and fragile, retained the quality she had described on the stage. The quality of a man who was genuinely interested in whoever was in the room with him. He saw her the moment she came through the door. "There she is," he said, and his voice was thin, but the warmth in it was not. "There's my girl." She crossed the room and she sat beside him, and she took his hands in hers, and Caleb's near the door, and he watched a father and daughter hold on to each other in the way people hold on when they know the holding is running out. He heard some of what they said. Not all of it. He wasn't trying to hear all of it. He heard her say, "Richard tried to take the estate, Papa. He forged your signature." He heard Harold Whitmore's voice go quiet and then tight. "I knew something was wrong. He kept bringing papers. I kept telling him I needed to read them first, and he kept telling me there wasn't time." A pause. "I signed some of them, Evie. I don't know which ones. Doesn't matter now. Alderton is handling it. The forgery is on record." Alderton. A breath that might have been relief. "Good man." "Yes." A pause. "Who is that?" Her father was looking past her at the door. She looked at Caleb. "That's Caleb Mercer," she said. "He found me on the road. He brought me in and he kept me safe and he helped me get to the land office, and he rode 15 miles at night to get a letter to Alderton." She paused. "He refused $500 from Richard to send me away." Old Whitmore looked at Caleb across the room for a long moment. Caleb met his eyes and nodded. The way you nod at someone whose respect you are not trying to earn but are receiving anyway. Harold looked back at Evelyn. "Is he a good man?" "He is the best man I have ever met," she said. And she said it without looking away from her father's face, straightforwardly, the way she said things when she was not performing them, but simply reporting the truth. Old Whitmore closed his eyes. He held his daughter's hands. "Good," he said. "That's good." He lived for 4 more days. Caleb stayed in Billings. He slept in the front room of Dr. Harmon's house on a chair that was not as comfortable as his own chair at the ranch, which was itself not particularly comfortable. He ate what Harmon's housekeeper brought out, and he was useful where he could be useful, and he stayed out of the way where staying out of the way was the right thing. On the second day, Harold Whitmore asked to speak with him alone. Caleb sat beside the bed in the chair that Evelyn usually occupied, and the old man looked at him with the particular clarity that Dr. Harmon had described, the lucidity that sometimes comes at the end, like a lamp burning brightest just before it goes out. "She told me what you did," Harold said. "All of it." "She did the hard parts herself," Caleb said. "She always does." Harold smiled, thin and real. "But she's never had anyone stand beside her while she did them. Not like that." He looked at Caleb. "Her mother died when she was 11. I did the best I could, raising her alone. I taught her everything I knew about the law and the land and how to protect herself." He paused. "The one thing I couldn't teach her was how to trust someone, because I didn't know how to show her that after her mother passed. I closed down some part of myself, and I never opened it back up, and she watched me do that, and she learned from it." His voice was steady, but his eyes were not. "That's the thing I regret most, that I taught her to be strong alone when what she needed to learn was how to be strong with someone." Caleb sat with that for a moment. "She learned it herself," he said. "She just needed the right situation." Harold looked at him. "A ditch," he said. "Yes, sir. Of all the..." And then Harold Whitmore laughed. "It was small and it cost him, but it was real. Of all the ways for it to happen." Harold grew quiet again. "You're going to stay," he said. It was not a question. Caleb looked at him. "If she wants me to." "I'm asking if you want to." He thought about the ranch, the 14 cattle, the 2 axle bolts, the north fence and the broken wagon, and the contracts he now understood well enough to challenge, and the east pasture that was his outright, free and clear, always had been. He thought about the chair by the fire and the table where two people had sat by candlelight working through the architecture of what was wrong and what could be fixed. I want to. Harold nodded slowly. Good, he said for the second time.
That's good.
Harold Whitmore died on a Thursday morning 4 days after Evelyn reached him, with his daughter's hand in his and the spring light coming through the window, and Dr. Harmon quietly present in the corner of the room. Caleb was in the hallway. When Evelyn came out, she walked directly to him, not to Harmon, not to the window, not to the door, directly to him, and she stood in front of him, and she put her forehead against his shoulder, and she cried, not dramatically, not with collapse or noise, just the deep, quiet, thorough crying of someone who has been holding something for a long time and has finally found a place to set it down. He put his arms around her. He didn't say anything. Nothing to say. He just held on. After a while, she straightened. She stepped back. She wiped her face with the back of her hand with the same matter-of-fact directness with which she did everything. And she looked at him. I need to go back to Hawthorne, she said. I need to be there when the independent examiner files his report. I know, and then I need to go home. To the estate. I haven't been there in 2 months, and Richard will have... She stopped. She took a breath. There's going to be a great deal to do. I know, he said again. I can't do all of it alone. He looked at her. You won't have to. She held his eyes for a moment. Promise? Yes, he said. That's a promise. She nodded once slowly, the way she nodded when she had received information she intended to rely on. They went back to Hawthorne. The independent examiner appointed by Alderton and brought in from the territorial capital filed his report 6 days after the suspension of Pruitt's examination. The report confirmed, in the careful technical language of a man who had spent 30 years examining documents, that the signature on the transfer deed was not consistent with known exemplars of Harold Whitmore's handwriting. The report used the word forgery. It used it clearly and without qualification. The petition for temporary administration collapsed the same afternoon. 2 weeks later, Richard Blackwell was served with a judicial notice of criminal fraud proceedings in the Montana Territory. He retained the best lawyers available. It did not help him as much as he expected. The 8 pages of notes from a ledger written by candlelight by a woman who had grown up in a courtroom, learning to pay attention to everything, turned out to be exactly as comprehensive as she had intended. Every name, every date, every amount. A map of 2 years of patient theft, rendered in small, precise handwriting that proved remarkably difficult to argue with. Cole cooperated with investigators in exchange for reduced charges, resigned his position, and made a full statement. Richard's judges quietly recused themselves from anything connected to the Blackwell name. The machinery that had taken 2 years to build came apart in 6 weeks because machinery built on other people's silence and confusion tends to be less solid than it appears. The people it was built on stopped being silent and stopped being confused. Evelyn returned to the Whitmore estate on a Tuesday in June. She arrived not as the frightened woman who had been run off a road and left in a ditch. She arrived with legal documents establishing her inheritance, a judicial ruling voiding every fraudulent transfer, and the letter from Alderton's court that effectively ended Richard Blackwell's ability to conduct business in the Montana Territory. In other words, as the landowner, the staff at the estate, the ones who had not been replaced by Richard's people, met her at the front. The estate manager, a man named Hobart, who had worked for Harold Whitmore for 22 years, shook her hand with both of his and said, "Welcome home, Miss Whitmore," and meant it with every word. She walked through the house that her father had built. She stood in his office, and she looked at his desk and his papers, and the shelf where he kept the books he had read to her on Sunday mornings. She sat in his chair not for long, just long enough to feel the shape of him in it, and then she stood up and she got to work, because there was work to do. Richard had not been idle in 2 years. The estate had been mismanaged in ways both obvious and subtle. There were contracts to review. She knew how to do that now, had always known, but had a new appreciation for the places where the language turned against you if you weren't careful. There were relationships to rebuild. There were ranchers in the valley who had been dealing with Richard's version of the estate for 2 years and had learned to expect a particular kind of treatment, and she intended to give them a different kind. She hired Hobart to manage the day-to-day operations, and she gave him the authority to actually do it, which was not something Richard had ever done. She reviewed every outstanding contract in the first week. She found 14 that needed to be challenged or renegotiated. She started with the most egregious ones, and 3 weeks after she returned to the estate, she drove out to Barrow Creek. She came in a proper carriage this time, her own carriage, with her own driver, on a road she had ridden in the dark on a borrowed horse not 2 months prior. She came to a ranch. Caleb heard the carriage before he saw it. He was at the north fence, of course. He was at the north fence. The north fence was always requiring something, and he straightened up and watched the carriage come down the road and turn in at his gate. He walked over. She stepped down from the carriage and looked at the ranch the way she always looked at things, taking it in fully, reading it. The barn, the cattle in the east pasture, and wagon in the yard that was now no longer broken because Caleb had finally bought the 2 axle bolts and fixed it the week before. She looked at the wagon for a moment, and something in her expression went soft and quick. She said, "February to June," he said. "Not my best time." She almost laughed. She turned to look at him. Her own clothes now, not the ruined, expensive dress of a woman who had been in an accident, not his old flannel patch garment, but something that was hers, that fit her. That was the clothes of a woman who knew who she was and dressed accordingly. She looked different in them. She looked, he realized, like herself. The full self, not the stripped-down survival version. She was still exactly who she had been at the table with his ledger. He found that reassuring in a way he didn't fully have words for. "I have a proposal," she said. He raised an eyebrow. "Right? I have 14,000 acres. She held his eyes. "You have expertise. You understand cattle operations, land management, water access, weather patterns in this valley." And she paused. "You understand contracts. You've had an excellent teacher." "Tubble," he said. "Not by me," she straightened. "I want to create a cooperative operation, not charity, a reward, a genuine business arrangement. I provide the land. You and the other ranchers in this valley provide the labor, the expertise, and the operation. Ownership of what is built is distributed to the people who build it." She paused. "I want to start with your land. I want it to purchase the parcels around your existing property and fold them into the cooperative. You would hold an ownership stake proportional to your contribution. All ownership. Documented, legal, and unassailable." He looked at her. "You've been planning this for a while." "Since about the 3rd day on your ranch," she said. "I read your contracts and understood what had been done to you and to every rancher in this valley by men who knew how to use paperwork against people who were too busy working to fight back." She met his eyes. "I have 14,000 acres that my father spent his life building. Hold it and manage it and pass it on to no one." Or she looked at the cattle in his east pasture. "I could use it to build something that means something, something that my father would recognize." Caleb was quiet for a moment. He thought about 14 cattle. He thought about the Aldrich grazing fee he was going to get back, now that Evelyn's lawyers had sent the appropriate letter to the appropriate people. He thought about the contracts he could now read, and the ones he had already challenged, and the small, real feeling of a man who has stopped being operated on and started operating. He thought about 2 axle bolts on a windowsill. "You're offering me a partnership," he said. "I'm offering everyone in this valley a partnership," she said. "I'm starting with you. Because you started with me." She held his gaze. "And because you are the best judge of character in Barrow Creek, and if you agree to it, the other ranchers will listen." He looked at her for a long moment. "You know," he said, "I found you in that ditch. I thought the most expensive thing about it was going to be the blanket." She looked at him. "And turns out the most valuable thing I ever gave away was a blanket," he said. She smiled. It was the full version this time. Not the edge of it, not the almost version. Real one. He had seen it coming for weeks, And it was exactly what he had expected, and it still caught him somewhat off guard, the way the best things always do. "Do we have a deal, Mr. Mercer?" she asked. He looked at his ranch, teen cattle, his fixed wagon, his north fence, his east pasture that had always been his, free and clear even when he hadn't known it. He looked at her. "We have a deal," he said. They shook hands. Then they stood there for a moment in the June morning with the valley spread around them, the land that was his and the land that was hers, and the land that would become something belonging to people who had earned it, the particular quiet of a place where something that should have happened a long time ago has finally happened. He said, "You want coffee?" "I still make it the same way." She said, "Yes." "Then yes," she said, "I'd like some." They walked toward the cabin together, and behind them, the valley was green and wide, and full of the particular promise of a June morning in Montana, the kind of morning that made you believe that what had been hard was worth it, and what was coming was going to be worth it too. Years later, people across the valley would tell the story of Caleb Mercer and Evelyn Whitmore. They would tell it at dinner tables and on front porches, and to children who were young enough to still believe that how you treated people was the most important thing about you. They would tell it the way true stories get told, worn smooth by repetition. The essential shape preserved even as the details shifted, because the essential shape was the part that mattered. A poor cowboy with nothing who gave everything. A woman with everything who had been made to feel like nothing. A ditch on a dark road that turned out to be the beginning of something neither of them could have planned. The greatest ranching cooperative in the Montana Territory, built on 14,000 acres, and the principle that people who work the land ought to own what they build. And two people who taught each other, in the most unlikely circumstances, that strength alone is survivable. Strength given to someone else is transformative. That the person with the least can sometimes give the most, and that what you choose to do for someone when there's nothing in it for you is the truest measure of who you are. Caleb Mercer had spent 35 years being measured by what he lacked. He spent the rest of his life being measured by what he gave. And that, in the end, was the only measure that ever mattered.